Why has everything gotten so expensive, and why is inflation at a 3-decade high of 6.8%? And who the heck is this Pierre guy threatening to fire the governor of the Bank of Canada? Those are the things that we're discussing in today's video, but before we do me that favor, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and please hit that like button so more people like you can see this video. And don't forget about our race to 25,000 subscribers, where we're giving away $5,000 to one lucky winner. Go to 360giveaway.ca to enter that contest. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's discuss inflation and why it hit a 3-decade high of 6.8%, because the numbers are absolutely huge. And there are certain politicians out there right now who would seemingly have you believe that this is all Tiff Macklem of the Bank of Canada's fault. And the reality of it is simply not. And we're going to discuss that as well, and how Pierre Poilievre, we're just going to call him PP, is threatening to fire the Bank of Canada governor, which is absolutely absurd and ridiculous. And by the way, before we go any further, if you're one of those people that can't have a conversation about politicians and policies, because that's what we're going to talk about today, not your individual beliefs and your individual needs and your individual ideologies, but real policies and real things that have danger in the economy, well, I'm going to go ahead and recommend that you shut this thing off right now, switch to a different video, go somewhere else, because we're going to have a real conversation about inflation, about why it happened, and it's not just printing money, and the realities of the dangers of saying things like you're going to fire Tiff Macklem, which is absolutely absurd. And by the way, if you're new here, you can rest assured that I've been just as critical of liberal politics, NDP politics, and conservative politics in the past. This isn't a political channel, nor do I intend to politicize anything, but we are going to have a conversation about political strategies and the policies that they are suggesting. So like I said, if you can't handle it, time to go. Now, that being said, let's jump into the headlines and take a look at what's going on here. If you take a look at B&M Bloomberg, this is based off of the Stats Canada released today, where inflation has hit an all-time high of 6.8%. Sorry, that's not accurate. It's not an all-time high. It is a 3-decade high of 6.8%. For some of us, this is an all-time high in our lifetimes, and these numbers are getting higher and higher. Last month, they were 6.7%. Now they are 6.8%. And we're going to talk about why that actually happened. And again, it's not all about printing money. The next headline I want to point out is this one, where Pierre PP, he says he'd fire the Bank of Canada governor. And this is the one that really bothers me. This is absolutely absurd. And we'll get into the actual inflation data and why prices of things have actually gone up. And I'm going to go from start to finish on why certain prices of things are going up so much. But I have to address this right now, because if you are Pierre, whatever, and you are suggesting that inflation is the Bank of Canada governor's fault, you either are not fit to be prime minister because you actually have that belief, or you are catering to party politics, which neither of those two things is a good thing. And here's the thing about being elected as a politician. I know it doesn't exactly work this way, but in order to get elected, you have to get the majority of people to want to vote for you. And if you're going to take a super right-wing, super ridiculous stance of it is the Bank of Canada governor's fault that we are finding ourselves in an inflationary period of time, well, I just don't think you're going to get the majority of people to vote for you. And I can tell you right now that as somebody who lives in one of the most conservative cities in Canada, if not the most conservative city in Canada, I can tell you that if you are going to take stances like this, you're going to lose a pretty large base of millennial voters. And this, quite honestly, conservatives, if you're listening, is why the liberal politicians have kicked your butt for so long. It's because you're losing out on the young people who have different ideologies than you do. You need to find a place in the middle where you can appeal to both. And I'm going to tell you right now that PP's not doing that. He's not even close, especially when it comes to the fact that he's trying to oversimplify this inflation thing and lay blame on single individuals, whether that's Justin Trudeau with his just inflation piece, or whether that is Tiff Macklem. And on top of all of that, I don't believe that the Liberals have done anything to improve the situation. And I genuinely believe that there needs to be a change in power. But if this is the stance that the Conservatives are going to take, well, we're going to end up with Liberal policies and probably NDP style policies if they have to cooperate for quite a long period of time. So this is where, I just have to say enough is enough from a policy standpoint. Pierre, you need to do better. And as good of an orator as you are, I genuinely believe you're a highly intelligent person. At least I hope you are. I have to believe that as good of a speaker as you are a highly intelligent person, and stop it with the crap that puts the Canadian economy in further jeopardy. If you're going to take the person who's responsible for our financial system, and really given the circumstances, the pandemic and everything that happened afterwards, if you're going to put him in the crosshairs of the public and make him look bad and try to lay the blame on him and make his job more difficult, you are helping no one and you're creating more of a problem, not fixing it. Now, political policy pieces aside, I do want to talk about inflation, because let's talk about the reality of how it actually happened. And no, it's not all printing money. Because let's talk about, first of all, what would have happened if they didn't lower interest rates when the pandemic happened. We would be having the exact opposite conversation of the conversation that we're having right now. And that would be, people would be very, very upset because they would have lost their jobs, because everything they owned would have gone down in value. And instead of talking about how the things that they want to own are getting too expensive, they would have been talking about the fact that everything that they did own became worth pretty much nothing. And in the event that the Bank of Canada had not decreased interest rates to make up for the lack of production that happened as a result of those first 3 to 6 months of the pandemic, well, we probably would have found ourselves in less of a fruitful time like we're in right now, and more of a Great Depression style era, which none of us would have wanted. So the Bank of Canada, the Federal Reserve, whether you want to play party politics or not, has done pretty much everything that they could have in order to make sure that we didn't come out of this in a scenario where none of us had jobs, none of us had any money, and we were pretty much all screwed. Now, all that being said, let's have a real conversation about what happened here in the economy and why prices on everything have gone up. And let's start from the beginning, because the first thing that we saw prices start to go up on was anything to do with sanitary supply. So this was the very first piece of inflation that happened in the economy. And this wasn't about there being more money in the economy, more money being printed. This was about a lack of supply of cleaning supplies, toilet paper, all the things that we lived through not being able to find on the shelves. And yes, those things went up in price because they were in such short supply. In fact, some of them went up substantially in price because people were buying out everything they could and turning around and selling them on Amazon and eBay and whatnot for double, triple, quadruple the price of what they actually should have been priced for. So that was the first signs of inflation. And that had nothing to do with money printing. It had everything to do with a lack of supply of those goods. And then the next thing that happened was we saw real estate prices start to go up. Now, in general, in a time like the pandemic, if we would have seen that sort of reduction in the amount of home buying that happened, and you saw lower interest rates come along, what you probably would have seen was those lower interest rates just barely prop up the market. But there was another thing that happened that was a huge influence in the Canadian real estate market, and that was the fact that people's preferences changed. They were no longer going into the office. They were realizing that their houses were too small. They didn't want to be working at home with their spouse and with their children and with their 3 dogs. So people wanted to have bigger homes so that they didn't feel so cramped in all of the time. They also wanted access to nicer amenities, like the ability to go outside and go for a walk, because you couldn't go to the gym and you couldn't go to the spin cycle or the barbell shop. You had to find other things to do, and that led a lot of people to want to be closer to outdoor amenities. So combined with these low interest rates that would have normally just propped up the market, we saw a massive change in preferences that caused there to be more demand in the market. And what that caused was the realization that there was a lack of supply for the new type of homes that people were buying, the lower density homes, the bigger homes in the suburbs, which led to a run up in real estate prices. Now, on top of that, anytime we see a big run up in real estate prices real fast, we start to get speculators. Yes, the people who go, oh, this is my chance to make a significant amount of money in a short period of time, who piled on top of the real estate market and subsequently ended up putting us in a situation where we had this craziness around the real estate market that led prices in certain areas like Vancouver and Toronto to go up even more than they should have. And furthermore, we saw prices in eastern provinces, which had that abundance of outdoor and green space and nice amenities, go up as well, as people started to move to other parts of the country that were more in line with the way that people viewed their future lifestyles. So all of this led to this massive run up in housing prices, which was probably one of the first major pressures on inflation, and those inflation numbers as a whole essentially getting higher and higher. Now, on top of that, we started to see oil prices go up and energy prices go up as people started to spend more time in their cars. Things got back to normal. You know, the days of the streets being empty went away, and that higher demand with basically not enough oil in production because the oil companies had all stopped their production basically led to a significant jump in energy prices. And that significant jump in energy prices pretty much leads to higher prices in everything across the board, especially if it's something that needs to be shipped from one location to another, which is pretty much everything. Now, on top of those higher energy prices and higher transportation costs, what we saw is major delays in manufacturing because as COVID hit certain manufacturing plants, things like microchips and things like everyday things that you would buy that would be imported stopped being produced for 2-3 weeks at a time, which ultimately led to these massive backlogs in shipping. And once the backlogs in shipping happened, that led to major supply chain snarls, which means we had limited supply of pretty much everything that's imported, and that led to higher prices pretty much across the board on everything else. Now, it doesn't end there because just as things start to look like they're about to go back to normal with respect to the supply chain, now we've got Russia and Ukraine and the war that is happening there. And here's the reality of it. This had one of the biggest impacts on inflation of everything. Because just as we're about to start to see the light at the end of the tunnel, Russia invades Ukraine, and basically the breadbasket and the energy supplier of Europe goes out of business, which means there's no more supply of grains and the things that it takes to feed most of Europe. And there's a pretty limited supply of energy as well, which means global prices of both grains and global prices of energy go up even further. Now, combine that with the fact that the prices of production of things like livestock and poultry and all of those things goes up because now you've got to spend more money on the grain to feed them, the fuel to transport them, and everything else that goes along with basically producing them. And you start to see this shift in demand for meats, and you start to see it shift to things like vegetables. Now, the vegetable problem becomes a whole other problem because fertilizer prices again go up substantially because we see this commodity boom, right? And that those higher commodity prices, those higher fertilizer prices, those higher energy prices all lead to significantly higher vegetable prices. And we already know that grain prices are going up. So breads and everything else and pasta is up 20%. And basically we find ourselves across the board, whether it is on housing, transportation, food, or anything else, is going up. And most of it has to do with a lack of supply. And if you want to argue the lack of supply versus the money printing thing, let me use vehicles as an example. Because here's the reality of it. Most car manufacturers are not selling more vehicles than they were in the last couple of years. There are more vehicles being sold because there's higher demand for used cars. But the reason that prices went up on new vehicles wasn't because interest rates got cheaper. It was because you couldn't get them. And dealers no longer had to discount the vehicles because they didn't have enough to sell. And because they didn't have enough to sell, that led to higher prices as a result of higher demand compared to supply. Now, there wasn't necessarily higher demand for vehicles, but there was more demand relative to the low amount of supply that happened. So all of this points to the fact that none of this is the Bank of Canada's fault. This is all clearly the fault of something that we could not control, which was the pandemic. And yes, there was money printed to spur production and to spur growth in those first few months of the pandemic. And if we wouldn't have had that, we would be having a significantly different conversation right now. But the majority of the inflation that is happening right now can all be explained through a lack of supply or certain things that happened in the economy that were unexpected. So to blame Tiff Macklem, to blame the Bank of Canada, to state that you're going to fire the Bank of Canada is absolutely absurd. And the reality of it is this: nobody saw this coming. Not just the pandemic, but all the things that happened after the pandemic that have led to higher prices. Because this shouldn't have happened the way it happened, but it did. And nobody had any control over that. So the reality of it is this, to sum this up, is money printing wasn't the problem. The pandemic was the problem. And all the things that happened as a result of the pandemic were the problem. So let's not go out there and try to string up Tiff Macklem or accuse the Liberal government or the Conservatives or the Bank of Canada or the NDPs of basically mismanaging this whole thing because they did the best with what they could. Let's look at the actual realities of what happened and talk about those. And Pierre, PP, if you're watching, if you're going to do something, let's talk about increasing supply of houses. Let's talk about things that would actually make a difference, not questioning the Bank of Canada, because the reality of it is this, is they have significantly smarter people than you working on these policies. They are doing everything that they can, and you as a politician need to take your eyes off of monetary policy and put them squarely on fiscal policy where you can make a difference. Forget what they're doing, focus on what you can change and what you can do better, and hopefully if you do, you'll find yourself the next Prime Minister of Canada. But if you don't, I certainly hope that we don't find you in that seat because you're unfit to be there.